October 8, 1943, 27,000 feet above Bremen, Germany, Captain Robert Rosie Rosenthal gripped the controls of his B-17 bomber as German fighters tore through his formation like wolves through sheep. Around him, bombers were exploding in mid-air, trailing fire as they spiraled toward Earth. His own aircraft, named Rosie's Riveters, shuddered from flak impacts that punched holes through wings and fuselage. Of the 12 aircraft in his squadron that had taken off from Thorpe Abbotts that morning, only his would return. This was Rosenthal's fourth mission over Germany. He would fly 52 combat missions total, each one a statistical impossibility of survival. In 1943, the average life expectancy of a B-17 crew member was 15 missions. The required tour of duty was 25 missions, a number most airmen never reached. Rosenthal would double it, becoming one of the most decorated bomber pilots in American history, while earning a reputation that bordered on mythical among his fellow airmen. But numbers alone don't capture Rosenthal's story. This was a Jewish lawyer from Brooklyn who volunteered to fly the most dangerous missions in the European theatre, who repeatedly refused opportunities to stop flying combat, and who led his crews through the darkest period of the air war when bomber losses reached catastrophic levels. His story intertwines personal courage with questions about duty, survival, and what it meant to fight fascism as a Jewish American officer when Nazi Germany was systematically murdering European Jews below the routes his bombers flew. This is the story of the man who defied death over and over above Nazi Germany. The pilot whose survival seemed impossible, and the leader whose example inspired thousands during America's deadliest air campaign. Robert Rosenthal was born on June 11, 1917, in Brooklyn, New York, to a family of Russian Jewish immigrants. His father had fled persecution in the Russian Empire, settling in America, where he built a modest life running a small business. Young Robert, nicknamed Rosie by childhood friends, grew up in a Jewish neighbourhood where stories of European anti-Semitism were part of family conversation, but seemed distant from American life. Rosenthal excelled academically, attending Brooklyn College before enrolling at Brooklyn Law School. He graduated in 1939 and began practicing law in New York City, seemingly positioned for a comfortable civilian career. His life followed a predictable trajectory: successful lawyer, active in Jewish community organizations, dating seriously, planning a future that didn't involve war. Then, on September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. Europe was at war again, just 21 years after the previous catastrophe. For most Americans, this was someone else's problem. The United States maintained strict neutrality, with powerful political forces arguing against any involvement in European conflicts. But Rosenthal, like many American Jews, followed developments in Europe with growing alarm. Reports filtered out about Nazi treatment of Jews in Germany and occupied territories. The full extent of the Holocaust was not yet known, but enough information reached America to make clear that Hitler's regime represented existential danger to Jewish communities. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States declared war on Japan the following day. On December 11th, Germany declared war on the United States. America was now fighting in both the Pacific and European theatres. The question facing every young American man became not whether to serve, but how. Rosenthal, 24 years old with a law career and no military experience, could have waited for the draft. His profession might have qualified him for non-combat service. Instead, he volunteered for the Army Air Forces in early 1942, specifically requesting assignment to bomber crews. When asked why he chose the most dangerous service branch, he reportedly stated that he wanted to fight the Nazis directly, to strike at the heart of Hitler's war machine. The decision reflected both patriotism and personal conviction. Rosenthal understood that Nazi Germany represented a threat not just to America's interests, but to Jewish survival. Flying bombers over Germany meant participating in the most direct American assault on Nazi power, For a Jewish American, there was symbolic resonance in bombing the regime that had made anti-Semitism state policy. Rosenthal's path to combat began with flight training at multiple bases across the United States. The Army Air Force's training program was intensive, designed to rapidly expand American air power from its small pre-war size to massive wartime strength. Rosenthal learned to fly multi-engine aircraft, studied navigation and bombing procedures, and trained with crews that would become as close as family. Bomber crews consisted of 10 men in a B-17, pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, top turret gunner, radio operator, ball turret gunner, 2 waist gunners, and tail gunner. Each position required specialized skills. More importantly, survival depended on the crew functioning as a perfectly coordinated unit. Equipment failures, navigation errors, or breakdowns in communication killed crews as efficiently as German fighters. By mid-1943, Rosenthal had completed training and received his commission as a captain, an unusually high rank for a first assignment pilot, reflecting his age, education, and leadership qualities observed during training. He was assigned to the 100th Bomb Group, known as the Bloody 100th, for the devastating losses it would suffer during the war. The 100th Bomb Group was stationed at Thorpe Abbotts in eastern England, part of the 8th Air Force's expanding bomber command. The 8th Air Force's mission was strategic bombing, destroying Germany's industrial capacity to wage war. The theory was that precision bombing of factories, refineries, and transportation networks would cripple German war production, hastening Allied victory. The reality was far more brutal than the theory suggested. In 1943, American bombers were flying deep into Germany without fighter escort for most of the mission. The P-47 Thunderbolts that escorted bombers from England had limited range, turning back before bombers reached their targets. This left B-17s vulnerable to swarms of German fighters that attacked with rockets, cannons, and machine guns designed specifically to destroy the American bombers. Flak, anti-aircraft artillery, added another layer of lethality. German radar-directed flak batteries fired shells that exploded at predetermined altitudes, creating clouds of shrapnel that could shred aircraft and crew. Bomber formations flew through flak fields while maintaining tight formation to maximize defensive firepower from their machine guns. Breaking formation meant becoming easy prey for fighters, but staying in formation meant flying through the flak regardless of the danger. Rosenthal arrived at Thorpe Abbotts in August 1943, just as bomber losses were reaching crisis levels. That month, the 8th Air Force lost 352 heavy bombers. Crew losses were staggering, thousands of trained airmen killed or captured. The life expectancy statistics were brutal. Most crews didn't survive their required 25 mission tour. The veterans at Thorpe Abbotts welcomed new arrivals with grim jokes and superstitions. Don't get too friendly with new crews, they probably won't be around long. Don't count missions out loud. Don't plan what you'll do after the war. These dark traditions reflected a psychological reality. Young men were being asked to repeatedly fly into situations where death was the most likely outcome. August 17th, 1943. Captain Robert Rosenthal stood at the pre-mission briefing as the intelligence officer pulled back the curtain, revealing the target map. A collective groan filled the room. Red strings stretched from England deep into Germany, terminating at Regensburg, a 1,400-mile round trip, the deepest penetration into Germany yet attempted. The target, Messerschmitt aircraft factories producing the Me-109 fighters that were decimating American bomber formations. This would be Rosenthal's first combat mission, part of a massive dual operation. While his force struck Regensburg, another bomber stream would simultaneously attack ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. The plan called for overwhelming German defences through coordinated strikes. In theory, it was brilliant. In practice, it became one of the bloodiest days in American air combat history. The mission briefing covered expected opposition, heavy flak over the target, fighter attacks throughout the route, and particular danger during the penetration phase when escort fighters would turn back. Weather forecasting suggested clear skies over Germany, good for bombing. accuracy, but also good for enemy fighters. Rosenthal's bomber lifted off from Thorpe Abbotts at 09:45 hours, joining a stream of B-17s forming up over England before turning toward Germany. The formation included 146 bombers from multiple groups. Each aircraft carried a crew of 10 men, 6,000 pounds of bombs, and enough ammunition and fuel to theoretically defend itself and reach the target. The actual mission bore little resemblance to the briefing's optimistic projections. German fighters attacked in waves, exploiting gaps in American fighter coverage. The Luftwaffe had developed tactics specifically for bomber destruction. Head-on attacks that gave American gunners minimal firing time, twin-engine fighters firing rockets from outside machine gun range, and single-engine fighters pressing attacks from all angles. Rosenthal's first experience of combat was sensory overload, the roar of engines mixed with the chatter of machine guns, the smell of cordite and hydraulic fluid, the bone-rattling impact of flak bursts, and the horrifying sight of B-17s exploding or falling apart around him. Bombers shed engines, wings, and tail sections. Some exploded in fireballs, others spiraled down with crew members jumping, parachutes blossoming white against the sky. His bomber took hits. Flak punched holes through the aluminum skin. A fighter's cannon rounds shattered the plexiglass nose. The bombardier was wounded, the aircraft's control systems were damaged, but the bomber stayed in formation, dropped its bombs on target, and turned for home. The return flight was worse. Low on fuel and ammunition, damaged aircraft struggled to maintain altitude and formation. German fighters picked off stragglers. Of the 146 bombers that entered German airspace that morning, only 122 returned to England. 24 aircraft and their crews, 240 men, were lost. Many returning bombers were so damaged they never flew again. Rosenthal's aircraft landed with over 100 flak holes, one engine failing, and wounded crew members. By the standards of that day, this counted as a successful mission. He had survived. His bomber could be repaired. His crew was mostly intact. This was mission 1 of 25. The Regensburg-Schweinfurt raid, as it became known, demonstrated the brutal reality of daylight strategic bombing in 1943. Combined with other operations that month, losses approached 20% of aircraft dispatched. At such attrition rates, the entire 8th Air Force would be destroyed before achieving its strategic objectives. But there was no turning back. The bomber offensive was central to Allied strategy. Rosenthal and thousands of other airmen would keep flying, keep rolling the dice against impossible odds, because the mission demanded it. October 1943. The 100th Bomb Group earned its nickname Bloody Hundredth through catastrophic losses that exceeded even the horrific averages of the 8th Air Force. The group seemed to attract misfortune, mechanical failures, navigation errors that separated formations, and concentrated German attacks that devastated their bomber streams. The worst came on October 10th during a mission to Munster. The 100th Bomb Group lost 12 of 13 aircraft dispatched, a 92% loss rate in a single mission. Only one bomber from the entire group returned to Thorpe Abbotts. Rosenthal was not flying that day due to aircraft maintenance issues, but he watched as the hours passed with no sign of his fellow crews. When the single surviving bomber landed, its crew reported the horror. The formation had been separated from the main bomber stream, leaving them exposed to concentrated fighter attacks that systematically destroyed aircraft after aircraft. The psychological impact was devastating. The 100th barracks, mess halls and ready rooms were suddenly empty. Men Rosenthal had trained with, flown with, shared meals and fears with, gone. The survivors faced a terrible calculation. If 12 of 13 aircraft were destroyed on a single mission, what were the odds of surviving 25 missions? Yet missions continued. New crews arrived to replace the dead, were hastily integrated into operations, and began their own grim count toward 25 missions. The turnover was so rapid that veteran crews of just 5 or 6 missions were considered experienced. 10 missions made you an old hand. 15 missions put you among the unit's most senior combat personnel. Rosenthal flew through this period, accumulating missions while the group hemorrhaged crews. His survival wasn't due to avoiding danger. The opposite was true. He volunteered for some of the most dangerous missions, including strikes deep into Germany where fighter opposition was heaviest and rescue prospects were nil if his bomber went down. On October 8th, the day before the Munster disaster, Rosenthal flew to Bremen as part of a massive raid on German industrial targets. The mission encountered fierce resistance. German fighters attacked in waves, exploiting every weakness in American defensive tactics. Of the 12 aircraft from his squadron that took off that morning, only Rosenthal's returned. The pattern repeated across multiple missions. Rosenthal kept flying, kept returning, while the aircraft around him fell from the sky. His crews began to believe their pilot was either blessed with supernatural luck or cursed to survive while everyone around him died. Either way, flying with Rosenthal seemed to improve survival odds, and crews requested assignment to his aircraft. The psychological burden of survivors' guilt weighed heavily on all long-serving bomber crews, but particularly on pilots like Rosenthal, who returned repeatedly while losing friends and fellow crews. Post-war interviews with bomber veterans consistently mention the horror of watching aircraft explode or fall apart, knowing that 10 men you knew personally were dying and being powerless to help. Rosenthal developed coping mechanisms. He focused obsessively on crew training, drilling his men on emergency procedures until responses became automatic. He studied German fighter tactics, learning to anticipate attacks and maneuver defensively while maintaining formation discipline. He insisted on meticulous aircraft maintenance, personally checking systems before missions. But he also struggled with questions that had no good answers. Why did he survive when better pilots died? Was there purpose in his survival, or was it just random chance? How many more times could he roll the dice before the odds caught up with him? By December 1943, Rosenthal had completed 15 missions, past the statistical point where most crews were lost. The 8th Air Force's average life expectancy had improved slightly as tactics evolved and long-range escort fighters began appearing, but missions remained extraordinarily dangerous. Every takeoff might be the last. The nature of the air war created unique psychological stresses. Unlike infantry combat, where soldiers experienced sustained periods in combat zones, bomber crews alternated between life-threatening missions and relatively safe existence at their English bases. They might face death at 27,000 feet over Germany in the morning, then attend a dance in a local English town that evening. The abrupt transitions between existential danger and normalcy were disorienting. Rosenthal threw himself into both aspects of this life. He flew aggressively, taking on the most dangerous positions in formations and volunteering for missions when his crew rotation didn't require it. On the ground, he engaged fully with base social life, attending gatherings, maintaining correspondence with family and friends, and mentoring new arrivals. His leadership style earned respect across ranks. He demanded excellence from his crews, but shared their dangers completely. He advocated for improved equipment and tactics, but never asked his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Enlisted crew members appreciated that their pilot was an officer who treated them as critical partners rather than subordinates. March 1944. The air war over Europe was transforming. New long-range escort fighters, particularly the P-51 Mustang, could now accompany bombers all the way to targets deep in Germany and back. This single technological development fundamentally altered bomber operations. German fighters, which had previously attacked formations with relative impunity once short-range escorts turned back, now faced American fighters throughout the mission. The impact on bomber losses was immediate and dramatic. Attrition rates, which had reached catastrophic levels in late 1943, began declining. Missions that would have resulted in 15 to 20% losses 6 months earlier now lost 5 to 7% of aircraft. The mathematics of survival improved significantly. Rosenthal, who had survived the darkest period of the bomber offensive, now flew during its most effective phase. By March 1944, he had completed his required 25 mission tour. Army Air Force's policy allowed crews who completed their tours to rotate back to the United States for rest, reassignment, or training duty. Most combat veterans desperately wanted this rotation, viewing survival of 25 missions as beating impossible odds and having no desire to push their luck further. Rosenthal declined rotation. He volunteered to continue flying combat missions, a decision that shocked many of his fellow airmen. The explanation he provided was straightforward. Experienced combat leaders were needed, and he felt obligated to continue serving as long as he could contribute to the mission. But there may have been additional motivation. Rosenthal was Jewish, fighting a war against a regime that was systematically murdering European Jews. While the full extent of the Holocaust was not yet widely known, enough information had reached the West by 1944 to understand that Nazi Germany was perpetrating mass atrocities against Jewish populations. For Rosenthal, continuing to fly meant continuing to strike at the Nazi war machine, to contribute to the destruction of a regime that represented an existential threat to his people. He also may have struggled with survivor's guilt, having watched so many friends and fellow crew members die, having beaten odds that seemed impossible. Perhaps continuing to fly felt like honouring their sacrifice. If he stopped while the war continued, did that diminish the meaning of their deaths? Whatever his motivations, Rosenthal continued flying. He assumed command of his squadron, leading formations on increasingly complex missions. The strategic bombing campaign was intensifying, with 1,000-bomber raids becoming routine. The targets expanded to include oil refineries, transportation networks, and increasingly, support for the planned invasion of France. The mission profile was also changing. Rather than flying as individual crews, bomber formations now operated as coordinated strike forces with precise timing, fighter coordination, and sophisticated electronic countermeasures against German radar and communications. Rosenthal's role evolved from simply surviving missions to leading them, making tactical decisions that affected dozens of aircraft and hundreds of airmen. D-Day, June 6, 1944, marked another transformation. The invasion of Normandy opened a second front in Western Europe, and bomber missions shifted partially towards supporting ground operations. Rosenthal flew missions bombing German positions ahead of Allied advances, destroying bridges to prevent German reinforcements, and striking transportation networks to isolate the battlefield. These missions were different from strategic bombing raids over Germany. They flew at lower altitudes with more direct impact on ground combat. The results were visible. Bombed bridges collapsed, destroyed locomotives, blocked rail lines, cratered roads, stopped vehicle movements. The connection between their missions and Allied success became more tangible, but danger remained constant. German flak batteries defending French targets were formidable. The Luftwaffe, though weakened, still contested the skies. Aircraft still went down, crews still died. The improved survival odds meant fewer deaths, but not safety. By August 1944, Rosenthal had completed 40 missions, nearly double the required tour. The 8th Air Force had revised policies to allow highly experienced pilots to continue flying if they chose, recognizing that their experience was valuable for training and leading less experienced crews. Rosenthal became one of the public faces of the bomber offensive, featured in military publications and bond drive materials as an example of American air power's success. September 1944. Most of France had been liberated and Allied armies were advancing toward Germany's borders. The strategic bombing campaign focused increasingly on targets inside Germany itself: oil refineries that supplied fuel for German military vehicles, factories producing weapons and vehicles, and transportation infrastructure that moved resources to the front lines. Rosenthal, now a major and squadron commander, continued flying despite having surpassed 50 missions total. Each mission added to an already statistically impossible survival record. The odds of surviving 52 combat missions over Germany in a B-17 bomber were infinitesimal. Yet here he was, still flying, still leading, His reputation had grown to near legendary status within the 8th Air Force. Stories circulated about the missions he'd survived. The time his bomber lost 2 engines over Berlin but made it home. The mission where fighter attacks killed 2 crew members but the aircraft completed its bomb run. The countless instances of returning with dozens or hundreds of flak holes while other aircraft in formation were destroyed. But Rosenthal deflected attention from his personal survival, instead emphasizing the crew members who made each mission possible. In interviews and conversations, he consistently credited his gunners, bombardiers, navigators, and engineers. His leadership style remained focused on the team rather than the individual, on the mission rather than personal glory. This approach earned genuine loyalty from the men who flew with him. In an environment where death was routine and tomorrow uncertain, having a commander who shared dangers fully and credited others generously created powerful bonds. Rosenthal's crews performed at exceptional levels, not from fear of punishment, but from desire not to let down a leader they respected. The final missions of 1944 targeted Germany's collapsing infrastructure. Allied armies were approaching Germany from the west. Soviet forces were crushing German defences in the east, and the strategic situation was clearly deteriorating for Nazi Germany. The question was no longer whether Germany would lose, but how quickly and at what cost. Bomber missions. During this period served multiple purposes, destroying remaining German industrial capacity, supporting ground operations, and demonstrating overwhelming Allied power to hasten German surrender. The raids also aimed to disrupt German transportation networks to prevent movement of military forces between fronts. Rosenthal's final combat mission as a bomber pilot came in late 1944. The specific date and target varied in different accounts, but all sources confirm he completed 52 combat missions. More than double the required tour and among the highest totals for B-17 pilots in the European theatre. The Army Air Forces finally insisted he stop flying combat missions. His experience and leadership were too valuable to risk losing in combat. He was reassigned to staff positions where his combat knowledge could benefit operational planning and training. For someone who had volunteered to continue flying long past when he could have stopped, this mandatory grounding must have produced mixed emotions. Relief, certainly. The psychological burden of repeatedly facing death had to exact a toll, but also perhaps frustration at being forced to stop while the war continued. And likely survivor's guilt, that familiar burden carried by those who survived when so many others didn't. May 8th, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. For bomber crews who'd fought through the darkest days of 1943 and 1944, who had seen the 8th Air Force's bomber streams grow from hundreds to thousands of aircraft, who had witnessed the systematic destruction of Germany's industrial capacity, this moment represented validation of their sacrifice. But for Rosenthal and other veterans, the end of combat brought new challenges. The transition from wartime intensity to peacetime normalcy was psychologically difficult. Men who had lived with constant danger, who had made life and death decisions routinely, who had commanded aircraft and crews in combat, now faced civilian life where those experiences had no parallel. Rosenthal faced additional challenges as a Jewish American officer confronting the full truth about the Holocaust. As Allied forces liberated concentration camps across Germany and occupied territories, the systematic nature and scale of Nazi genocide became undeniable. The photographs, testimony, and physical evidence revealed atrocities that exceeded the worst fears articulated during the war. For someone who had fought the Nazi regime directly, who had flown missions over Germany while the Holocaust continued below, the revelations must have been profound. Rosenthal had understood abstractly that Nazi Germany threatened Jewish existence. Now the concrete evidence showed the mechanized murder of 6 million Jews, along with millions of others deemed undesirable by Nazi ideology. The bomber offensive Rosenthal participated in had destroyed German industrial capacity and hastened Allied victory. But it hadn't stopped the Holocaust. The concentration camps continued operating until physically overrun by Allied forces. The bombing of Auschwitz or other camps, advocated by some during the war but rejected by military planners, remained a controversial topic for decades. Rosenthal didn't publicly discuss these questions extensively in immediate post-war interviews, but they must have weighed on anyone who had fought the war while being of the people Nazi Germany sought to exterminate. His decision to keep flying beyond his required tour, to continue striking at Nazi Germany as long as possible, took on additional resonance when the full truth about the Holocaust emerged. In the immediate post-war period, Rosenthal returned to the United States and was involved in various military and civilian activities. He remained in the military for a period, participating in the trials of Nazi war criminals and contributing to documenting the bomber offensive's strategic impact. His testimony about bombing missions and their effects on German war production was considered authoritative. He eventually returned to practicing law, building a successful career in civilian life. But he remained connected to his military service, participating in veteran organizations and reunions with surviving members of the 100th Bomb Group. These gatherings provided opportunities to reconnect with men who shared experiences that civilians couldn't fully understand. The bonds formed during combat proved enduring. Bomber crews who survived developed relationships that lasted lifetimes based on shared trauma and survival. Reunions provided space to discuss experiences, to remember those lost, and to process the psychological impacts of what they had endured. Rosie Rosenthal lived until 2007, passing away at age 89. In the 6 decades following World War II, he built a distinguished legal career, raised a family, and became an advocate for Holocaust education and memory, but he was forever defined by those 52 missions over Nazi Germany, by the impossible survival that made him a legend among bomber veterans. The decorations he earned told part of the story: Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star with Oak Leaf Cluster, Distinguished Flying Cross with 5 Oak Leaf Clusters, Air Medal with 13 Oak Leaf Clusters, and Purple Heart. These awards documented extraordinary heroism and sacrifice, but they couldn't fully capture the experience of repeatedly facing death while so many around him died. Rosenthal's legacy exists on multiple levels. Within military aviation history, he represents the bomber crews who fought the strategic air campaign over Europe. His 52 missions exemplify the courage required to keep flying when statistics said you should be dead. His leadership demonstrates how exceptional officers inspired crews to perform at their best under impossible circumstances. Within Jewish American history, Rosenthal represents the tens of thousands of Jewish Americans who served in World War II, fighting a regime that was simultaneously murdering their co-religionists in Europe. His voluntary extension of combat service reflects the personal stakes many Jewish service members felt in defeating Nazi Germany. The broader significance of the strategic bombing campaign remains debated among historians. Did it shorten the war and save lives by destroying German industrial capacity? Or did it constitute a moral failure through the killing of German civilians without proportionate military benefit? These questions don't have simple answers, and historians continue analysing the evidence from multiple perspectives. What's clear is that men like Rosenthal flew because they believed the mission was necessary and just. They endured horrific losses, witnessed their friends die in terrible ways, and continued flying because stopping seemed impossible while the war continued. Whether their sacrifice achieved its strategic objectives or could have been accomplished differently doesn't diminish the courage they demonstrated. The Masters of the Air miniseries, released in 2024, introduced Rosenthal's story to a new generation. The dramatisation, while taking some creative liberties with historical details, captured essential truths about the bomber offensive, the terrible losses, the courage required to keep flying, and the bonds between crew members facing death together. Rosenthal's story resonated particularly because it wasn't purely triumphant. He survived, but many didn't. He achieved great things, but at costs he carried forever. He was heroic, but also human, afraid, uncertain at times, carrying survivors' guilt, questioning whether his survival had purpose or meaning beyond chance. This complexity makes his story powerful for contemporary audiences. World War II veterans are often portrayed in simplified terms: the greatest generation, heroes without doubt or fear. But real people are more complicated. Rosenthal was brave and also afraid. He was confident as a leader, but uncertain about his own survival. He was decorated for extraordinary heroism, but likely questioned whether he deserved survival when others didn't. The Jewish dimension of his service added layers of meaning. He wasn't just fighting for America. He was fighting against a regime that wanted him and his people dead. Every mission over Germany was personal in ways that complicated the already complex experience of combat, and when the full truth about the Holocaust emerged after the war, it must have transformed how he understood his own service. October 8, 1943. Captain Robert Rosenthal returned to Thorpe Abbotts as the only aircraft from his squadron to survive the Bremen mission. He climbed down from Rosie's Riveters, surveyed the flak damage to his bomber, and faced the reality that 12 crews, 120 men, hadn't returned. This was his fourth mission. He would fly 48 more. The mathematics said he should have died. The odds said his survival was impossible. Yet mission after mission he returned while aircraft around him fell from the sky. Luck alone couldn't explain it. Skill mattered, leadership mattered, crew excellence mattered, but even all of that shouldn't have been enough to beat those odds. Rosenthal never provided a satisfying explanation for his survival. In interviews, he deflected attention from himself, crediting his crews and expressing sadness for those who didn't make it home. He didn't claim supernatural protection or special deserving. He survived, and he carried that fact as both blessing and burden. The legacy isn't just survival, though that's remarkable enough. It's what he did with that survival. The leadership he provided during the darkest period of the air war. The example he set by continuing to fly when he could have stopped. The contributions he made to defeating a regime that represented existential evil. Robert Rosenthal was a Jewish lawyer from Brooklyn who became one of World War II's most decorated bomber pilots. He flew 52 missions over Nazi Germany during the war's deadliest air campaign. He led when leadership required sharing the dangers faced by those under his command. He survived when survival seemed impossible, then spent decades grappling with what his survival meant. His story reminds us that heroism is complicated, that courage coexists with fear, and that survival can carry burdens as well as blessings. The bomber crews who fought the air war over Europe faced terrors most of us can't imagine, losses that seem incomprehensible, and they kept flying anyway. Rosenthal exemplified that courage while also embodying its costs. The man who defied death 25 times, then defied it 27 more, lived a long life after the war. He achieved success, raised a family, contributed to society. But he was forever marked by those missions over Germany, by the friends lost, by the impossible survival that made him legend. In the end, perhaps that's the most important legacy. Not the decorations, or the survival record, or the historical significance, but the simple fact that he flew when flying was necessary, led when leadership was needed, and endured what had to be endured. And then, when it was over, he lived with what he'd witnessed and done, carrying both the pride of service and the weight of survival. Robert Rosie Rosenthal, bomber pilot, hero, survivor. His story stands as testament to the courage of those who flew the bombers over Europe, to the sacrifices of a generation, and to the complex humanity behind every act of wartime heroism.